Welcome, everyone. Let us just let a few more colleagues join the room. But in the meantime, I wondered if we could see who's available, who's around, and please feel free to put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat, as per usual. Welcome. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give everyone another minute to join. But in the interim, could you put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat? It's so lovely to see. Who's in this dark black room? Hello, everyone. I believe more than 350 people registered for this webinar, so I'm just going to give another minute for others to join, and then we'll start in a minute, less than a minute, I promise. Okay, we've got lots to cover, so I'm going to jump straight into it. My name is Elizabeth Girdwood, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar on whether the ELOM tools have predictive powers. Can early assessments reliably predict future literacy and numeracy outcomes? This is the second time you've heard from me this year, and I'm absolutely delighted to be facilitating this early childhood systems webinar. Today, we'll be digging into the Roots and Shoots longitudinal study, which tracked 585 grade R children across the Western Cape over 3 years to examine how their early school readiness skills related to later learning outcomes. Children were assessed using various South African assessment tools, the ELOM 4 and 5 at the start of grade R, the ELOM R language and maths tools at the start of grade 1, and the EGRA and the EGMA at the end of grade 2. And this has allowed researchers to test the predictive validity of these early assessment tools and what this means for practice and policy. So we welcome you today and look forward to hearing your voices as we engage with the key findings of this research paper. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to start with some housekeeping. As you know, we use a very fairly standard format across every webinar, but we've got 2 presenters today. Dr. Becker and Hofmeyr's presentation will take 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for a 15-minute discussion and fielding of questions. We're recording the session, and everyone should please keep their microphones and cameras off to avoid any interruptions. At the end of the presentation, we'll be answering questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box or raise your hands. Depending on time, I may ask you to ask your question directly, but please be precise and respectful of our limited time. The technical team will manage your muting and unmuting. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the speakers. Firstly, Dr. Heleen Hofmeyr is a senior researcher at RESEP, who co-hosts this webinar series, the Research on Social Economic Policy at Stellenbosch University. and she's a principal investigator of the Roots and Shoots longitudinal study, which follows children's learning and development from school entry through the foundation phase. Her research focuses on early learning, school readiness, social emotional development, and educational inequality in South Africa. She works closely with government and non-governmental partners to generate evidence that can inform educational policy and practice. Dr. Jürgen Becker is today calling in from Los Angeles, where it's 2 a.m., and he is based at Axe Consult and is an NRF-rated researcher specializing in psychometric and statistical modeling. He has held academic positions at several South African universities, including Stellenbosch, University of Johannesburg, the University of Pretoria, and the University of the Western Cape, where he was a full professor. As a measurement partner to Data Drive 2030, he is a central contributor to South African standardized early learning measurement infrastructure. He's co-author of the ELOM-R technical manuals, the LPQA technical manual, and a contributor to the analyses of the Thrive by 5 data. And then I am aware that Prof. Andy Dawes, who needs no introduction for most, is online and is one of the co-authors of this paper, is ready to jump in and answer any questions should the need arise. But over to you, Heleen and Jürgen.
Thank you, Liz. Let me just share my presentation and let me know if you can see it, please. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect, Jürgen. Go for it.
Okay, I'll start my timer here. So good morning, everybody. I see there's 57 people here or 57 people that talked in the chat. There might be many, many more. So the introvert in me is very happy that I'm in the comfort of my own office here and I'm not in front of hundreds of people. But to each and everyone, good morning. It's actually the first time I've been on the same time zone as South Africa because it's morning here in Los Angeles and it's also morning in South Africa. And really, before I start the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge my colleague Caitlin Björnsky really did the heavy lifting on this presentation, but then she really put me in a wonderful situation because she is on leave and she's in Italy somewhere and it's 2 a.m. in the morning here in Los Angeles and I'm standing in for her. So there's definitely some coffee and brownies coming my way when she's coming back from leave. But yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge her and then Andy Dawes that helped with the analysis strategy, and then Heleen that shared the data with us to do this very important study. Okay, so the title of our study is Do the ELOM Tools Have Predictive Power? And I'll take you through a couple of slides. I'm going to try to keep it to about 30 minutes. At some point, I'm going to hand over to Heleen, and I'm going to leave a lot of time for your questions right in the end. Okay, so we know that specifically cognitive skills and as it pertains to language skills and math skills are critically important for children's school readiness, but we also know there's sub-elements to it, like for example, gross, fine, and perceptual motor skills, and then specifically social skills. And all these skills combinedly make sure that the child, number one, has the capacity to acquire knowledge and also the emotional capacity to socialize in the classroom and to be productive on the growth path. So all of these are important, but there's a more extended list, and I'm just going to run through some of them over here. I think anybody that's in ECD, this will be familiar to them. We know socioeconomic status is a very important factor because it contributes to the resources you have at home and the interactions. Not only that, it's also a marker of the quality of schooling that parents can afford for a specific child. Socioeconomic functioning, we talked about. Perceptual motor skills, executive functioning, IQ. But specifically, if we drill down into the literacy component. It's vocabulary, phonological awareness, letter sound recognition, oral language, demonstration of letter identification, and print knowledge. And most of these components are measured in the ELOM suites. Not all of the components, but most of them are measured. And these are important markers to indicate if a child is, number one, ready for school, and number two, how they are going to progress through school. Because if they're not ready for school, we see that there's a lagging effect and it's difficult for them to catch up. On the math side, we know oral counting, fluency, number identification, discrimination between two quantities, addition, subtraction, and so forth and so forth. I'm not going to run through the whole extensive list. There's one study that we know of, and this is coming from Prof. Andy Dawes, so I'm going to trust him on the literature because he knows the literature inside and out. But if you know of any other studies, you can let us know. This was a study by Van Sale colleagues on the ASB. They tested children at grade 1 and then at grade 4 again on language and maths. And what makes this study unique is that, as Liz indicated, we tested children at entry into grade R, grade 1 and grade 2, which is a very formative part of the child's development. I'm going to skip over this graph because this might actually give a lot of people post-traumatic stress disorder from statistics class. I'm going to give this graph, which is much easier to understand. This is coming from the Thrive by 5 study 2024. And you know what this is indicating is that based on the ELOM 4-5 total, only 42% of our students, of the children, is on track when they go into grade R, and that's a shocking figure. And we'll stratify that in the next slide by school fee, which could probably be roughly seen as an indicator of school resources. And you would see the green columns indicate that those are the on-track children. You can see it's got a steep gradient as you go from the Q1, the low fee schools, to the high fee schools. And inversely, you've got the other thing happening, which is the red clusters, which is falling behind and falling far behind, actually is very high at the lower quintiles and dipping down in the high quintiles. So most of the burden of the falling behind and falling far behind is in the low fee schools, which by definition is lowly resourced, and therefore children are falling behind on average in those schools more than on the high fee schools, which we would expect. These are just the same graph stratified by the dimensions of the ELOM 4-5. ELL is emergent literacy and language. 53% of the students on track, almost like half of them not on track by definition. Gross motor development, 44% on track, so less than 50%. Cognitive and executive functioning is CEF, only 40% of students on track. And emergent numeracy and mathematics, 33%. And then fine motor coordination and visual motor integration, only 29%. So that's the dimension where least amounts of students are on track. So this kind of shows you that even within the different domains, within the areas that a child needs to excel in, there's big differences in where you need to focus on getting everybody at least on track. Okay, so why is this all important? Why is this research important? Starting behind and staying behind. So the skills that children developed in the preschool or foundational school years are very important for their future learning. And what typically is coming out in literature is that there is a gap that just compounds if you have not enough school readiness at the early stages. So it's very important to close that gap as early as possible. And then, yeah, like I said, the gap compounds and the gap just gets bigger and bigger, and it's more resource intensive to close the gap the longer children goes into the school curriculum. Okay, so why is this important? There's limited evidence of this in the South African samples. Most of the tooling that's used is international tooling that's not benchmarked and normed in South Africa. And there's not this sort of like step or scaffolding between grade R, grade 1 and grade 2, which is the very important formative years. And I would encourage everybody that's here to help us with more longitudinal studies that we can track this, these three categories and see how it unfolds over time. Okay, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Heleen just to talk about specifically the roots and shoots study, how it came about, what the sample was, and then I'll discuss the results again.
Thanks very much, Jürgen. Just a note, I'm trying to switch on my video, but apparently the host is preventing me from doing that. So I don't know who that is and if that person can put my video back on.
I think you can carry on talking while we wait, Heleen.
Okay, cool. So yeah, just a little bit about roots and shoots. There we go, there I am. So as Jürgen explained, this work, really the overall Roots and Shoots project was trying to investigate this issue. We know, we've seen the Thrive by 5 results. I think the study we started with it in 2022 when Thrive had just come out, the first round of Thrive. And we saw, okay, we see these massive socioeconomic inequalities in ECD. We see massive socioeconomic inequalities in grades 1, 2, and 3 and beyond, but limiting it to that. And what's the relationship between these two things? So the study was designed to be able to track learners from their point of entering grade R and following them over 4 years until the end of grade 3. So that was the overall Roots and Shoots longitudinal study. And with the data that we've collected over the 4 years, we're able to answer the core research question that this piece of work is about, which is really how predictive are scores on the ELOM 4 and 5 of later literacy and maths achievement. And Jürgen will talk a bit also about how literacy and maths was assessed. But just to talk through the 3 waves of data collection. So as I mentioned, learners were assessed at the start of grade R. So most of them were about 5.5, on average 5.5 years old. And the ELOM 4 and 5 was mentioned, as well as the social and emotional functioning assessment that forms part of the ELOM 4 and 5. 1 year later, in the first term of grade 1, the same learners were assessed again, this time using the ELOM R, maths and literacy. Sorry, I've got a small puppy here who's enamored with a mirror. And in the third wave, the same learners were assessed again, this time in the third term. So there's a 1.5 year break between waves 2 and 3. And the early grade reading assessment and early grade mathematics assessment were used to assess learners when they were in grade 2. Next slide, please, Jürgen. Okay, so the final study sample in grade R, so wave 1, we had 585 learners. We had aimed for 600 learners across 75 schools, so randomly selecting 8 learners per class. But because of things like caregivers refusing or not feeling comfortable with their children participating, or conditions in schools being not appropriate for the ELOM assessment, 15 learners were dropped from the original sample. 50 of the 75 schools are Afrikaans medium and 25 were isiXhosa medium. And importantly, whenever I talk about this study, people hear the Western Cape and they think, oh, that's not relevant to our context. But it's important to note that the sample is a predominantly low-income sample. It was specifically, the sampling was specifically designed so that we have a majority of children from low-income households. There's a small percentage, actually technically 11%, that are from what we call mid-fee schools. And they were included mostly to provide a comparison group to compare the outcomes across the socioeconomic distribution. So yeah, when you hear the study, it's Western Cape, but it is still predominantly low income. Jürgen, if you just go back one slide, just want to make one point about the final sample that is used in this particular study on predictive validity. So you'll see there's a big discrepancy between how many children we started with in wave 1 and then how many we actually have data for in the study. So learners were included if they had complete data for all 3 waves. Because of the study design, that was the inclusion criteria. So that's about 70% of the original 585, 378 learners. In other work, I have investigated whether there's potentially some bias in the learners who were retained versus those who attrited. So the good news is in terms of the ELOM scores of learners, so they're functioning on the ELOM 4 and 5, there's no particular selection bias that is picked up here. So if anyone's wondering if it was weakly performing learners who were more likely to attrite, at least just simple balance tests show that that's not the case. So you can, if anyone's interested in those details, that's on the Roots and Shoots website. Cool. So that's all the details about Roots and Shoots. Jürgen, back to you.
Thank you, Heleen. Yeah, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the tooling and the measures that we've used. So as part of the data collection, we've also included a social and emotional functioning scale, SEF for short, and it basically consists of 2 components. So that's the social relations with peers and adults, and emotional readiness for school. And these the SEF measures have shown to be very important predictors of acquiring knowledge and assimilating in an ECD center. So that was included. It was used together with the ELOM 4.5. And then here's the dimensions I mentioned briefly earlier on ELOM 4.5, gross motor development, cognitive and executive functioning, fine motor coordination, emergent numeracy and mathematics, and emergent literacy and language. That's the language component. The ELOM R is the one that we administrated at the second wave. So that was, first we did the ELOM 4.5, then the ELOM R. At the second and the final wave was the outcome variable, which was an independent measure, which I'll talk to now. The ELOM R is a more broader assessment in the sense that it doesn't have all these subcategories. We mainly have a language component and a math component to it. And then the EGRA and the EGMA, like we've mentioned earlier, is the early grade reading assessment and the early grade mathematical assessment. These 2 assessments are considered to be very robust, reliable assessments that's used internationally quite extensively. So I think the Heleen and her team who designed this study wanted to benchmark our findings with these tools because that would make it comparative to international studies, and we have an independent bench that we can compare the results to. So demographic data, of course, for sampling and to make sure we've got the right cohorts, child age is important, gender and home language is important, and then the SES was the socioeconomic status was measured by this 13 binary household assets. Heleen can talk more to that, but basically how this index is put together is you indicate whether the household has these assets, and it's then compiled in a principal components analysis, and that index is then used as a proxy for SES. There is some niggles with it, and it's not perfect, and there's some ways we want to improve on it, but that is a typical way how it's indexed in these kind of studies. Here's the model that we started off with, and I'll just briefly talk you what our thinking was behind this. The the first thing we wanted to understand is we know that socioeconomic status and SEF, socio-emotional functioning, has got a direct impact on child readiness and acquiring the knowledge, the foundational knowledge that you need to be successful in school. And gender previously showed that there was also differences. So we modeled those as independent variables, predicting ELOM 4.5. ELOM 4.5 in turn as a composite score, not on the subdimension level, was predicting ELOM R version 1 and ELOM math. And then both of those ELOM components were mediators onto EGRA and EGMA. What's not in this figure is that there's also a direct relationship from ELOM 4.5 to EGRA and EGMA, which I'll talk to about, which is the partially mediated path. Okay, so here's the standardized coefficients. You'll see that gender is not in here because it wasn't significant. There is, in the literature, oftentimes a gender differentiation on these tools. It was somewhat surprising that SES had that fairly low correlation of 0.095, but very strong correlation between the SEF component and ELOM 4.5. So that hypothesis substantiates the fact that these social emotional dimensions is critically important for acquiring the necessary skills to be successful in school. ELOM 4.5, very strong relationships with the language component, the math component of ELOM R. And then that relationship then in turn very strong with EGRA and EGMA. What's interesting here and worth standing still for a second on is, although the mathematics is strongly related to EGMA, which we would expect, and the language is strongly associated with the EGRA, there was also the cross correlations between math and the literacy tool and language and the math tool. And that's really substantiate these points that crystallized intelligence is really a composite of sub-intelligences, but you've got a central intelligence acumen that works across these two domains. And so they do work in tandem to some extent. So just what I've reiterated in the previous slide, SES was a positive predictor, but not nearly as strong as SEF. There might be a methodological artifact that we might have to deal with there, because we know just from the bar plots that I showed earlier that we know that the scores were significantly higher on the ELOM scores for higher fee paying schools. So that should be the same over here. Gender was not a significant predictor, which is good because we don't want gender bias across these tools necessarily. Yeah, and then the ELOM 4.5 was strong predictors on socio-emotional functioning. So the step from grade R to grade 1, so that's between the ELOM 4.5 and the ELOM R. Very strong correlations. I mean, for you that can't remember all the stats classes, these correlations typically go up to 1. So in the social and behavioral sciences, 0.7 is a very strong, it's not an effect size, but a very strong indicator. It's a very strong relationship. And it shows that there's definitely some degree of validity between the two tools, predictive validity, and then the ELOM 4.5 tools explain between 32 and 35% in the variance in grade 1 language and math. The last stage, which was basically from ELOM R to the EGRA and the EGMA, which we can consider sort of the criterion measures or the independent measures that measures math and literacy. Once again, strong relationships, not only between their associated modules in ELOM R, but also language on math and math on language, which was good to see because we do know that there's overlap in those cognitive abilities. Okay, what the evidence tells us. The evidence is important. It might look like a bland study, but this is critically important for policy and also for tracking children that's falling behind on a big scale and classes that's falling behind. We need tooling that's geared for the South African samples that works in a fair and reliable and a valid way in the South African samples. And this is the first study that we see that actually tracks waves over time, where we can see the compounding effect and additive effects over time. The ELOM tools capture competences that matter for later learning and educational success. There's a very good brief on the Data Drive website talking about the fade out and not fade out effect, which is relevant here in the sense that, you know, if the literature suggests if you don't close these gaps, you know, over time, they might actually come closer to each other. But in other circumstances, if you reinvest in them, you can close the gap between those learners or those students who are falling behind and not falling in, but it requires continuous investment over a period of time. So that's a very important policy program. And then there is really a need for large-scale assessment across the country to identify groups of learners that's falling behind, almost like on a cohort level. It's very expensive. It's not even done continuously anymore in first world countries, but really in a country that's struggling to close the gap and reach the educational standards that we would like, measurement is going to be key in closing those gaps. What's the final implications? We have got confidence that this tooling works, that they've got sufficient reliability, validity, they're normed on South Africa. So I think our researchers and you know, public people who've got an interest in the ECD space can use them. It's important to identify groups and communities that's falling behind and that needs intervention and resourcing. And the key challenges that we need to have is we can build on these tools to kind of close the gap, but we need much more dedicated resourcing, specifically at the areas where there is underperformance. And then a burning issue is really we didn't test here is the quality of the center. So you could be potentially in a low fee center, but you could actually be quite well resourced via external funding or non-for-profit organizations, and the inverse could be true. So that's why sometimes we see when you move from quintile 1 to 2 and 3, the falling behind actually goes up, which is contrarian to what you would think. So really we need strong measures of ELP, the center qualities, and then also the quality of the facilitators and the teachers to measure exactly what's happening at the center level. There's a piece of research that Prof. Andy is working on, and I've worked on independently with Caitlin, that shows actually most of the variance in child outcomes and readiness is actually explained on the class level, on the class level, and not on the individual level. And that's an important mechanism to close the gap. Okay, so what is some of the things? I've kind of said this already, but parent involvement is very important. We have a study on home learning environment that will come out now one of these days that shows that the home learning environment is critically important for interaction and for children to acquire the skills that they can't necessarily pick up at the center. We know that these centers are not always staffed with people who's got the requisite skills and requirements, just because it's an under-resourced environment. So schools who's got better teachers and better resources, those children typically outperform their peers in the same area or in the same demographic. And then the government policy, we've been beating all on this drum about the dedicated resourcing to close the gap and to have really specific interventions where they are needed. Limitations. So I've kind of mentioned this before. The asset-based SES needs more work. I think our colleagues at the center in Stellenbosch, this is their forte. We need more differentiation on these SES measures. Like I said, we don't have an indication of quality of teaching and learning. There is some studies that's coming out. In the last Thrive by 5, we collected quite a lot of information on on the specific measure plus the home learning environment. So that research should augment what we're doing here. ACS had a small effect. We kind of know why that is, but the main thing that came out ACF is very strong. So the emotional functioning piece is extremely important. And yeah, then I guess from researchers like me, the ask is that we have more of these longitudinal kind of studies. I know they are extremely expensive and difficult to align, but these first 3 cohorts are extremely formative in early childhood development. But you know what's important is there's quite divergence in the literature around this fade out effect. So what's critically important is to see if the continuous investment actually closes the gap, or if the gap accentuates. So do we have the kind of buffering effect where students who go who shows that they're not ready for school and might be underdeveloped, close the gap if they go to high quality centers, and vice versa. And I think that's a critical piece of research that we still need to do to inform policy and how to direct resources. So with that, I've got 46 seconds left on my clock, so I'm going to stop here and really hand over to your questions, and just to prime my colleagues here that I'm a methodologist, so if there's anything ECD specific, I'm gonna reflect back to Liz and to Andy that's in the audience, and to Heleen. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jürgen. Yes, the Q&A box is full and busy. So let's start it quickly. The first question, I'm just going to read it out because it comes from someone who's anonymous. But basically, I'm sorry if I missed it, but were there any measures of home environment for support and learning included in the study?
Heleen, I think that's for you. I would think no, but we have it in the others, the bigger Thrive studies. We have that, but not, I think, in this specific study.
Yes, thank you for that question. So sadly, we did try and collect this information because it's obviously so important. But the only kind of way that one can do that is to try and reach parents somehow. And the only tool that we had up in us, in my arsenal as an economist, was just to send home surveys, which unfortunately the response rates were just too low to actually say anything meaningful about. So that's definitely a limitation of this work. We do have a small sample of parent responses, but not enough to be able to say something about the broader sample. So if anyone has any suggestions about collecting that information as we hopefully take this study further, or even just tips for improving response rates, that would be very much appreciated.
Thanks, Heleen. And I think the next question actually perfectly dovetails that from Patricia Martin. I wonder if you've been unmuted, Patricia, if you could ask it yourself, because she's actually asking about the plans to continue the investigation. Patricia, or should I read it out?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, sorry, I could be unmuted. So, hi, Sonia. Yeah, so I just wanted to know if the study that you've done is going to continue, so that we can find out if ELOM is predictive of a longer-term dropout, school performance, and ultimately child development by the age of 18. Because that is where policymakers really are looking at the moment. It will really justify investment in corrective measures if we can show that the ELOM study or ELOM results could be addressed by long-term investments to make a change to our development outcomes, child and national. I don't know if that was clear or garbled.
I think it was pretty clear, yeah. Heleen, maybe that one for you. I don't know if it's you, Liz, or Heleen.
No, Heleen.
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 answers to this, which I'm excited about both. So the first is in terms of a root and shoot specifically, there's definitely nothing stopping us from following these children over time, with the caveat that it is this, this Western Cape sample. But the second answer, and I'm very glad Sonia put this in the chat because I wasn't sure if I was allowed to reveal this here, but Data Drive is working with the DBE to connect the first 2 rounds of Thrive by 5 data to learning outcomes, specifically the things that were mentioned, dropout, repetition, those kind of outcomes at a national level. So that's, I think, out of 8 out of the 9, out of one promise missing. So yeah, that's a very exciting piece of work that's happening. That's not part of Roots and Shoots, but is definitely in the pipeline on the Data Drive side.
Thanks, Heleen. Ty, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself next and potentially ask your best question of the 3 that you put in the chat, because there are quite a few coming up also in the chat. So Ty, over to you. Let me jump in. Sorry, Ty. Ty's got a couple of questions. Firstly, were certain domains more predictive than others? Heleen, Jürgen, this may be a question for you. And then was there a difference in the predictability between languages? And then there's final questions about... Oh, hello, Ty. Have you been unmuted?
Sorry. My internet was being really spotty. Yeah, Liz, would you mind reading out those questions? I actually can't see them right now.
Okay, no problem. And then the last question was predictive validity stronger amongst households from lower SES households, among households from lower SES?
Yeah, all great questions. ELOM 4.5, like you can see here, we just use the aggregate, so the total score. There's definitely merit in splitting it on the sub-factor level and see exactly what's happened between them. Definitely, you would probably expect that dimension. I always forget these names, but for example, the literacy one would probably be stronger associated with language, and the numeracy, for example, with the mathematics one. But they may also be crossover effects. Like, so it might not always work that way. So that's something that we will definitely look at. I can't answer you on. Sorry, the second question was around the household. Was it the
difference?
SES?
Yes. So the second question was a difference in predictive validity between the languages.
We haven't tested that yet. I don't know if Heleen has tested that, but that's certainly something worth doing. But we haven't tested that yet.
And then the last one was predictability stronger amongst lower SEF households?
Also, I don't have that stats with me. We did actually run it, but I don't have it offhand. But yeah, I can't remember what it was, but we did test it. We did split it. I think one of the issues on the language side is that I think the bulk majority of the sample was probably Afrikaans. If I just looked at that spread, so we might run into some power problems between the isiXhosa and Afrikaans, but that would certainly be something that we are interested in. Where our research agenda is now at is this information that you see here is all on a single level, which is on the individual level, but we are starting to incorporate, like I said previously, classroom. So are people in different classroom having different outcomes, and then the home learning environment, which is on the aggregate level, and how does that impact on school readiness? And we're finding very interesting results there, where almost like all of the influence is coming from the quality of the center in these learning outcomes. So yeah, certainly we will look at that, but those are all great things to explore further in the future. Yeah, I just don't have those stats handy here.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Jürgen. Ken has a question regarding, Ken, could you answer directly?
Sorry, am I unmuted now?
Go for it.
Perfect. So thanks for the presentation. So I'm just curious, maybe this is a question to Heleen. You'd spoken a little bit about fade out at the top. I'm curious to know if we've compared the results from this study to what we've seen internationally in terms of what the range of predictive effects of these sorts of assessments over this number of years is in the kind of international literature.
We have not yet. I mean, we haven't included a piece about comparing the effect sizes. I have my own reservations about doing that when we're using very different instruments. And I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts, Kane. So I think for me, it's my reservations about making those comparisons have trumped my inclination to want to put it in the international perspective. So the answer is not yet, but definitely see the potential value in doing that.
Thanks, Heleen. Ken. Josh Aronser has a classically detailed question for you, Jürgen. Over to you, Josh.
Morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Oh, awesome. Cool. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'd like to maybe take a bit of a deeper look at the analysis. It is like a paper, but I was just wondering, I think you said at the start that the 378 children came from 75 schools, which obviously means that they're not statistically independent observations. So I was wondering if the model just accounted for children being clustered within schools. Was there any like cluster robust standard errors or like a fixed or random effects model? Specifically the questions that I put quite a few questions in the chat, but I think we can maybe just maybe answer in terms of if there were any, like, did you look at like intra-class correlations for ELOM 4 and 5, R, EGRA, and so forth? And if there's like any variation in the outcomes between schools rather than between children within schools.
Yeah, I can answer that from this study. I don't know if we've got a filter variable on the class level, but like I said, we've done that with another study that we have, not in this study. Home learning environment didn't explain that much variance, but the interclass correlation was huge on the program that the children were in. So almost 30% of the variance were explained by the classroom aggregation. So what that basically means is that students who end up in the right in the right program or in the right center, it's almost like the luck of the draw, because they will by definition outperform their peers with the same ability level in a poorer program. It was interesting that the home learning environment didn't explain that much. Myself and Andy have been having a ping pong conversation on email around it, and I think our measurement is just too crude to pick up the quality of the home learning environment as opposed to that it matters. We do think it matters, and it probably is more equivalent in its effect size compared to the center quality. But I think our measure is just not crude enough. So in the next version of Thrive, we will look at that. But when you're talking about magnitudes of 30%, it almost like outweighs the individual level in characteristics of the child. So it's almost like that, where you end up is more predictive than almost anything else. Yeah, so I think their Prof. Anne, I see he's unmuted. Maybe he wants to add his 10 cents. But yeah, what we also see is that unfortunately there is a strong cumulative effect. So stronger students in stronger ELPs, that cumulative effect just augments. It's just going stronger and stronger and stronger. And the students that has a deficit that's in the buffering effect. So in other words, a student who has a development backlog, if I can use that word, ending up in a good ELP, doesn't seem to get the buffering effect that a strong student has. Andy, help me out here if you've got a different perspective. I think they actually have a paper in press.
Welcome, Andy. I know your hand's been patiently up. Over to you.
Morning all. Just on that particular point, there's quite a bit of literature on this issue of what one might call compensatory effects or buffering effects for kids kids unlikely to perform well who then get elevated through a better preschool, or what's known as the additive effect. So a child who has got quite a good ability goes into a good place, and those two add together to increase the effect. We need to look at that more in our context here. This study doesn't allow us to do that because we don't have a solid measure of preschool quality or school quality for that matter. The school quintile fees, no fees, that sort of thing is very, very coarse and doesn't help us very much either. And I think Tyron asked earlier about the disaggregating by quintile and so on, or somebody asked that question. You can't do that in this study because the vast majority of the kids are in no-fee schools. So they're very similar kind of school quality. And as we've seen in Thrive by 5, it's that group of kids, Q3 down to Q1, who are performing very similarly. So we aren't able to do that here. Regarding one of the things I think that would be interesting is the data drive's work on positive deviance. In other words, looking at kids who are who are doing well despite the odds, from poorer backgrounds, from poorer schools, but are outperforming the rest. What's going on there is an interesting question, I think. So that different literature and different piece of research will be helpful. I think one of the other things to take on board here is I believe we use the term socioeconomic status far too loosely, and we have too many different ways of measuring it. And so different studies will call it SES, but it's not the same thing. So here you've got an asset-based SES. In other studies internationally, traditionally in early development, SES refers to income, maternal education normally, and occupation. So it's occupational classification, income, and education. We don't have that in any of our studies. I don't even know whether South Africa still has occupational classifications and ratings. We used to, and it would be useful to think more particularly in all this work about what our standard approach to this problem is. Because it's not socioeconomic status, it's actually household wealth that we're talking about here. So I think that's something that Data Drive and others need to get their heads around. I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Glenn Takalani has a concern about measurement bias, and I wondered, Glenn, if you could directly ask your question.
Hi, Elizabeth. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thanks. I was just wondering about the measurement bias, which is like a major concern when using scales like socio-emotional functioning, especially when it predicts so strongly across different cultural linguistic groups like the one that's being used in the sample, Afrikaans and isiXhosa. So I just wanted to check if the reliability of that the SEF was checked and how it is measured across the different groups in the sample. Mostly concerned about the languages and what is the finding if that was checked, and just also curious, and maybe I missed it, how much of the partial effects of the ELOM 4 and 5 scores actually contribute to the total effect on the EGRA and EGMA scores. So essentially, is the learning that we're seeing that's being cascaded from grade R to grade 2 that is carried over to grade 2? Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Jürgen?
On the SEF, I'm trying to recall if we checked the bias on the item level. I know on ELOM we've done extensive analysis on the item level with IRT, for example, and we've also looked what we call additive diff on the factor level. And certainly there were as we would expect, there were differences between the specific language groups. If I actually recalled it from the analysis, at least on the ELOM-R, I know your question is about ACF. I can't talk to ACF, but I know on the ELOM-R specifically that the Xhosa group was the closest to the Afrikaans and English group in ELOM-R, but I can't give you a specific answer on the ACF. What one have to be very careful for is to assume that bias or diff on the item level translates to diff on the factor level, because sometimes there's an equaling out effect between these things. But certainly, if it's non-uniform, you will have an impact on how those results translate within groups to the outcome variables. And I think your last question was around, how much of the effect of ELOM 4.5 is visible in EGRA-EGMA? Did I get that question correctly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so you're talking about that direct effect. So that effect was actually fairly strong, and it's hard for us to understand why. Once again, I might actually tag Andy in here, but we did see that there was effect sizes of at least 0.2 to 0.3, not as strong as between ELOM-R and EGRA-EGMA, but there was the relationship between ELOM 4.5, EGRA, and EGMA is both direct and mediated. So it seems like some of the variance is going through ELOM-R, but then there's also direct relationships to EGRA and EGMA. And it's probably because these two measures, even because they are pitched on a different level for different kids, foundationally they have a lot of overlap. So you would expect some of that, the echo effect, we call it the echo effect, to be visible in EGRA-EGMA, although ELOM-R is closer associated with that level of measurement. So because they share a competence set, you will still have that relationship. But they were not as strong as the ELOM-Rs, 0.2, 0.3, I think. We did test for that. We thought initially, just to answer your question indirectly, we actually thought that the effect of ELOM 4.5 on EGRA-EGMA would disappear once we model in ELOM-R, but that was not the case. There was still some residual variance explained by ELOM 4.5 on EGRA-EGMA.
Thanks, Jürgen. We've got precious 3 minutes left. Heleen, Shakira has asked a question about the SEF. She says, SEF is shown to be a very important for young children in the ECD phase, but is there an SEF measure that exists for children in the foundation phase?
I think Andy has his hand up potentially to want to answer that. I know of some, but Andy is I think, going to answer us.
Okay, go for it, Andy.
Right, thanks for the question. Yes, the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire developed by Goodman years ago would be the appropriate measure, because it enables someone, parent or a teacher, to rate the child's social and emotional functioning on quite a short scale, and it has been used in South Africa and translated into a variety of languages. So I would suggest you go with that. And we've also, by the way, going back to the SEF discussion, our SEF instrument, in fact, has concurrent validity with the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which is good. And going back also to the question about validity across the different languages, I've got to remember these are two very short scales. The emotional part is 6 items, and the social part is also 6. So very short, and in our work on translation, we haven't seen any difficulties in getting it translated, double translated back and forwards and so on, into all 11 languages. And I doubt, we haven't formally tested diff, as Jürgen was talking about earlier, and that would be something useful to do once we've got the data to do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to the other questions, which are so fabulous, because we should be closing right now. But essentially, children's early learning outcomes in this country remain deeply challenged, and tracking children from grade R to grade 2. And the study shows a clear trend that the stronger earlier performance on the assessments is closely linked to later success in reading and maths. The journal article on this piece, as asked in some of the questions, has been submitted post-review and is awaiting publication, but we've just directed you in the chat to the blog piece on the Data Drive website and the attached insights brief. Thank you all for participating and joining us today on this cold Wednesday in Cape Town. And look out for our next webinar on the 2nd of September by Dr. Chakona, which is entitled Nourishing Beginnings, Giving Every Child a Healthy Start. Thank you, everyone, for your active participation, and see you again soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.